Well, good morning and good afternoon. We have a wide variety of people joining us from a lot of different time zones, and it's really a pleasure to have you back here on another episode of Conversations in Crisis. In the past, we really have focused more on the crisis from the standpoint of communications perspective. But today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Steve Schuckenbrock. And Steve, I'm really thrilled that Steve has agreed to be part of our advisory board at Legend Labs. And so it's a great opportunity for me to work directly with somebody that I usually admire and respect, and actually was a former client when he was at Dell. And so today's conversation, while we will focus a bit on communications, I think will be a bit more expansive and dig a little bit more deeply into some of the operational aspects of organizations and how they're coming out. And we're going to have a special focus on what we used to call SMB, small and medium-sized business. You now hear it more often referred to as the middle market. But these are businesses that can range anywhere from 2 to 5 million up to 50 to $100 million in revenue. And so there are relatively, small in comparison to some of the bigger corporations that we've talked about in the past, but yet they're big enough to have strong customer bases. And so I think what Steve and I would like to talk about are some of the things that we've observed already as best practices from some of these organizations, but then also share some thoughts and some insights, as to what you might be thinking about at this stage of the crisis where, again, none of us are going to try to predict where exactly we are, the end of the beginning of the end, but clearly we're entering a different phase. I think everybody would agree with that. And so specifically, Steve and I are going to dive into, this notion of really doing kind of an honest internal assessment of where you are today. So regardless of what you may have done right or wrong, you're at a point right now vis-a-vis your employees, your customer base, and any number of other key constituents. And so we'll talk about the importance of really having an honest assessment about how your organization has done up until this point so that you sort of know where you're going and starting from. We're also going to talk about some really great practices that we've seen with these organizations that are engaging all their key constituents to sort of help them write the future. So rather than sitting in some, oval tower and trying to just sort of project a vision, on the world, this notion of really engaging your employees. Do you want to return to a workplace, or do you want to have a modified work at home? And similarly, engaging your customers and others in really imagining the future. I think we'll also talk a bit about the idea of, this really gives you license to be bold. And so, we would, I think, say, and we've seen some great examples, that this is your best opportunity probably to not let a crisis go to waste and to really let your thinking be bold in terms of how you transform your organization. And then finally, we'll spend just a little bit of time talking about the need to really understand how do you sustain some of these new quote unquote best practices going forward. So we'll open it up for some questions. We did get some questions in advance, by the way, so thank you to those of you that submitted some questions in advance. So with that, Steve, maybe I'll just kind of turn it over to you and let you share some of your broad observations about what you've seen and what you're seeing in this middle market space.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and I appreciate the chance to spend some time with you in this conversation. It'll be fun. I think the reality is we don't know exactly where we are in the process, but we do have to recognize that it is evolving and changing pretty dramatically. And when you see the fact that over 100,000 small to medium-sized businesses have already declared that they're done, they're not coming back. Clearly, the consequences of this are still being sorted out. And so I don't want to just sort of focus on, how good things can be when we get through this without recognizing the suffering and the pain that a whole lot of entrepreneurs are going through, and, being grateful for what they've done and what they continue to do as an entity that collectively employs 47% of the citizens of the United States. And so, we've got a lot of people that are very anxious for the leadership of the small, medium business entrepreneurs that really do drive the economy of the United States. When you think through, some of the things that have gone on, I think have to recognize that a lot of the stuff that's going to work as you come through the crisis are the things that would have worked really, really well for you prior to the crisis. And we've been talking about them in business magazines and books and so on and so forth, whether it is digitization of your business, whether it's employee engagement, customer satisfaction, obviously the innovation that continues and that SMB is the driving force, but even things like mission statements and being purpose driven, which is part of engaging both your clients as well as customers. All of those are sort of fundamentals that if you put a really tough lens up against how well did you do that in the past, it probably sheds some light as to what's working and what's not working so well as you think about each of your constituencies today. And I think from that assessment, you do really get an opportunity to start thinking outside the box. But I think you framed it up really well, and it starts really with that assessment.
So I'm not going to make the mistake that I made on our last conversation, which is to wait until the end to introduce my colleague, Christina Rubino. So Christina, thank you for being here and helping us get this organized. And then when we get to the point of Q&A, for helping us manage the question and answer. So welcome and thank you for being here, Christina.
Thanks.
Steve, one of the things, you spent a good part of your career, in fact, all of your career in technology, one form or another. And, we've always had the great promise that technology would sort of deliver, a new level of efficiency, and in many respects it has. But I guess what I'd like to, hear from you is, what do you think the next frontier that we see in front of us that technology, obviously these Zoom calls would be a great example, but where do you see technology really stepping up and helping to, meet the next frontier of needs in this new world order?
It's a broad set, but starting with the things that everybody is experiencing now, this notion of working from home. And I think there's a lot of people that believe that it's here to stay and it's never going to go away now that people have grown accustomed to it. However, if you look at, there was an article, I think it was in Forbes over the last couple of days, and it really studied Gen Z and millennials relative to working from home. And in theory, they have no technology barriers because they already knew how to do all of this entering in. Yet, by a very large percentage, they're more anxious about working from home versus having the social interaction that you get in an office than Gen Xers are, as an example. And it's pretty amazing and striking to see that technology is not the barrier. It's what's the process that you have for engaging one another and having proper conversations? How actively involved is the manager in a remote situation and having one-on-one dialogue, not just Zoom calls as a group periodically? Basically, how do you adapt to the new reality that technology has enabled? And I think that's going to be the bigger barrier. And making sure that we find ways to engage. And that's just one aspect of the technological opportunity that comes through all of this. And it has pretty far-ranging implications. Sure, that technology has costs, but so does real estate. Right. And what's the trade-off and the right balance that's going to come out of this whole thing as it begins to evolve?
Right.
The other end of that spectrum to me is everything that you can do in a zero-touch, automated, online kind of a fashion, you should. And it's not just because we've seen that carry out is now a new phenomenon in restaurants, or we've seen that the ability to order and have things delivered to your house is even more important now than it was even 6 months ago. But it's also because it is a subsystem that allows your company to operate irrespective of the situation they find themselves in, whether it's a physical world or a more virtual world. Those that did not make those investments prior to the crisis have found themselves scrambling on just getting the technology in place, yet alone the process and the cultural disciplines that make it all work.
You know, I was as surprised by you looking at that research because I think intuitively we always thought that old guys like us, you know, are sort of the ones that sort of go punch the clock in the office, and you know, we demand that the younger people, you know, come in at, you know, at a certain hour and be there. If you're not there, you're not really, you know, engaged, and that it would be us that were demanding that, and the young folks would be like, hey, we can do this, you know, remotely. But I have had the same observation as you, not just looking at research, but actually talking to our own people. And they like the physical interaction. They like the, you know, being together, you know, in the space, even if it's 6 feet apart. So I think you're right. I mean, this is a cultural adaptation, and it won't be one size fits all. And I think that lines up pretty perfectly with this notion that we spoke about at the very beginning, which is really doing an honest assessment of, you know, how your organization has been doing over the last 10 to 12 weeks in this environment. And I think, you know, what businesses probably really need to do is not just, you know, make their own assessment based on their experience, but really ask their people, you know, so what's been the best thing about this and what's been the worst thing about this? And if we wanted to meet in the middle, what might it look like?
I think if you take that framework that you laid out and you add this notion of what is our mission, you know, our purpose, if you will, how well is the digital strategy in working to serve our employees and to serve our customers and our clients? How people-centric, how engaged do you feel as an employee of this company in this circumstance? And then what is our true customer satisfaction? I mean, are they delighted to have our participation in leadership, or are we somehow or another not that important to them?
Right.
And I think if you seek honest feedback, not only from the employees, but from the customers and the clients on each of those dimensions, and use that as a way to really calibrate where you are in the moment, I think you've got the backbone then that you can begin to build a strategy for where, you know, what do we do now? What do we do next? How do we calibrate? How do we communicate?
Yeah.
I think we've seen a lot of fairly generic communication, and then we've seen some really, really good communication coming out of this. And I'm convinced it's those people that are kind of grounded in reality that are able to communicate most effectively right now.
You know, one of the things that we've been talking about, you know, going back to the early days at Dell when we went through, you know, the early adoption of digital and social media, was the way in which these technologies basically scaled intimacy. So we said that essentially social digital technologies allowed you to create an environment where every customer feels like they're your only customer. And we said that one of the things that was a great proof point on that was this whole notion of crowdsourcing. And so we had the ability to kind of go to the crowd and say, you know, kind of tell us what you want. And then we let the crowd vote up and down, right, until we got to the best, you know, solution. And there was a lot of great innovation that occurred. And I feel like that's what we're talking about right now, is really kind of, in a sense, crowdsourcing your future by listening to your most important constituents and really getting them to tell you what has worked best for them, and what might work better, you know, if you put your mind to it.
And what frankly is not working.
Right.
I mean, you know, I've talked about it a little bit. I think I quote Sam Walton on this because I think he's the one who said it, is, you know, never spend a dime in good times that you would cut in bad times.
Right.
And I think part of this self-assessment tells you the things that you're spending time and money and energy on that aren't valuable.
Yeah.
So that you can free up what are unbelievably precious resources now to spend on things that are deemed to be very valuable. And I think that's what this sorting out process really does. And it leads you to the opportunity to then say, okay, well, now that I've got that assessment and I feel pretty good about, understanding where I'm at, I can then begin to engage where do we want to go?
Right.
What should we do? I mean, there's business models that are forming out of today's reality that really weren't that important to some companies or to many companies in the past. I mean, we saw one that got sent around recently. I think it was, I want to get the name right because I thought the guys did a really interesting job. Hot Diggity Dog Walking. It's a little small company. Basically, they're dog walking services, and they also do pet sitting. But they found that actually people have other needs during this crisis, and they've got people that are available to their homes that can provide different services and expand what they do as a business. It could include waiting on a contractor to show up. It could include doing some other, going and picking up something and bringing something back while they're out on that dog walk, whatever the case might be. So I just think, while that's a simple little example, there is opportunity in all of this. And if you listen to your customers carefully, I'm sure they'll help you find that way.
So before we leave this particular part of our discussion, I'd like for you just to kind of operationalize this for a business owner that may be out there in our audience today. And, they're listening and they say, I think this makes a lot of sense. What's the step one, step two, step three to act on this thinking that we're sharing that's based on stuff that we pulled together from the best practices?
Well, if you accept the framework that I mentioned a moment ago and really focus on customer satisfaction, employee engagement, your mission and purpose, and the fourth one that I just scrambled down was just how people-centric is your culture. We've been talking about, that engagement is it reality? I'm sorry, I just messed that up. Digitization was the fourth one. So it's people-centric, employee engagement, digitalization, purpose, and customer satisfaction. If you accept that as a good framework to measure a business against, then my first step would be to say, let's sit down with employees and understand, where were we when we entered this crisis? What were the problems and the issues and the challenges that we were all wrestling with?
Right.
Where are we today? What has been exposed that is new that we weren't wrestling with before? It might be remote work. It might be able to serve customers remotely as opposed to having to send people on site, whatever the case might be. Walk through each of those with a clear lens and get the feedback, as you said, from your employees and your stakeholders as well as your customers. The other thing you've got to do is, what is the competition doing?
Right.
I mean, are they innovating in some way that you hadn't thought of? Or are they in defense posture?
Right.
And it's really important to understand whether you have a basis against which to play offense.
Right.
Because there may be a great opportunity to do it.
That's a really good point. So one of the things that we've talked about is this idea that, if there were ever a great time to go bold, this could be it. And one of the things that we've observed with a few companies that we've worked with, for example, is, they have a model for, in this case, moving more and more of their client and customer interactions to the cloud, but they still have 2 feet in the old sort of world, non-digital, right? And so they've got, this very small piece of their customer base that they've been successful because they were early adopters and they've moved. And one of the ideas that we've seen some organizations really, tag into is this notion of using this period to say, hey, for this percentage of our customer base, we've been able to really help them seize a unique advantage and opportunity by moving them to the cloud. And so where it would have been a conversation that might be like really hard and painful because, I like my old school ways, and suddenly it becomes a little more easy to have that conversation because everybody is in the mode of expecting change.
Yeah.
I'd like to just get you to kind of comment on, how do you leverage this moment to go bold?
Yeah. I think you go back to um, a little bit of the old Wayne Gretzky, skate to where the puck is going.
Right.
And in your particular example, there is no choice but to engage consumers digitally in some cases, as opposed to physically, as it's been done in the past. And I think I know the situation, where the example that you're referencing, and essentially, their customer was embedded in the idea that there had to be physical contact between the consumer and their team, and that there was really no other way to do it. And in some ways, they were even protecting their own resources through their thought process. And they're so embedded and so entrenched and so difficult to move. Well, now it's no longer really up to the decision makers that they've been making calls on. The consumer has declared,
right,
this is the way I have to be served. I am not coming into your building anymore. And we don't know how long that's going to last.
Right.
You and I were just chatting at the beginning of this about restaurants. And we're all focused on what the government's going to allow us to do. And is it 25% or is it 50%? And what physical, blah, blah, blah. Reality is the consumer is going to dictate when they want to come back.
Right.
And they're going to dip their toe in the water, just like you did yesterday and I did, last week. And I decided I'm not going back in the water for another week or so, because there was stuff I saw that I didn't want.
Right.
And, I'll go back when I want to go back. Well, right. You apply that to your example.
Yeah.
These guys can hold on to the physical world as long as they want. The reality is the consumer is going to dictate everything has to be done digitally.
Right.
So these migrations are going to happen. And I think it's going to happen across many, many industries where things that can and should have been done electronically will start to get done electronically. And this is an accelerant for that.
I think one of the advantages that these middle market or small businesses have is their agility. The relative size probably gives them greater opportunity to move quicker, be more agile, more nimble. One of the things that I've observed, in taking big companies through massive change, is the need to really understand the anxiety that gets created with really good people, by the way. I mean, these are people that maybe have been with your organization for a number of years. They help create many of the practices that you're currently, relying upon or were before this crisis. And the idea of not leaving them behind, meaning building a bridge that lets them know that they can cross over into this new world and that you want them to. You want them to be part of the future. But figuring out a way to help get them mentally prepared to embrace change and to help create the new model, as opposed to just sort of having this notion that you're either on the bus or you're off the bus. I've always felt that was a kind of a really crude way to look at and embrace change. What are your thoughts?
Well, you're the expert at it. I mean, the reality is the way to get them to cross that bridge is to include them in the entire process of building that bridge. Right. So that they have the context, have the time and the ability to understand the journey, and they can see themselves on the other side of that bridge.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of fear and uncertainty that guides some of the issues that you referenced a minute ago. And so true inclusion is the best medicine. And I can tell you, I've done it right in the past and I've done it wrong in the past.
Right.
And you lose institutional knowledge, but more than that, the people that stay sometimes and say they're on the other side of the bridge haven't actually crossed yet.
Right.
And so you really do need to take the time to do what you're suggesting in order to make sure that they're on the journey with you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It goes back to that whole notion of if you engage them in creating the future, they feel a sense of ownership that probably really helps them kind of get up the curve much quicker.
Yeah, and just to, I think the notion that these small, medium businesses, this middle market is more agile is dead right. And they're also more innovative because they can make decisions faster and solve problems faster. Yeah. They all, but at the same time, they lack resources. And so I sense that everybody is struggling with the trade-offs now of just not enough resource to be able to do what they want to do because they're in survival mode.
Yeah.
And I recognize that, and that it's sort of survive first, and then you go into this kind of aggressive decision making. Right. And in that aggressive decision making, you're going to have to make some tough trade-offs. And I don't think there's a choice. I think that's what people are wrestling with right here, right now.
Right.
I think as long as they follow sort of the guide of what really matters, they'll get through that process very well. And I think they'll formulate a future that says, hey, I used to be this. I'm now going to be a subset of that, but I'm adding this other capability.
Right.
That is very important. And, you look, there's a number of different companies that are currently wrestling with that. And I go back to the restaurant model because I don't think curbside pickup's going away.
Yeah. By the way, drive-in movies are coming back.
I think there's all sorts of things that are going to change for the better. I mean, it's going to make it actually a better consumer experience.
Yeah. Same reason I keep all my old ties. They always go and come and go. So I've got ties that are 30 years old. Yeah. But in fact, what we're really also seeing is that it, in some respects, a more personalized, high touch, not really high touch, but high touch feeling from a technology point of view, more customized, experience, which I think is pretty cool.
I do too, and I don't want to just beat that one drum, but I actually think this crisis, out of every good crisis, every bad crisis, mm-hmm. some good ideas and some good energy can come out of the other side. And I think this notion of enhancing the customer experience, enhancing the employee experience through proper use of technology is one of those things that's going to happen very quickly.
Before we move to the fourth platform that we wanted to talk about, which is how do you sustain these new activities. Earlier in this crisis, let's say 6, 8, 10 weeks ago, on these types of webinars, we've done a couple, 2 or 3 of them now. And I was really strongly stating that, be careful about, your sales mode, because people just weren't in the mindset to be sold almost anything. And you really saw most of the television advertising, shift from, features and benefits kind of oriented ads to more, we're all in this together. And so I don't know, exactly when the switch will turn. I will tell you, I'm kind of getting sick of those commercials. I mean, I really am. Every time you turn around, it's like we're on. In fact, somebody sent me a meme, video meme, where they put like 50 of these commercials together and run one reel. And somebody said there must only be one advertising agency out there like serving all these companies, because all the language is exactly the same. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to get to is we probably are now, as we resume activities, whether it's 25% or 50%, getting back to that part of the new normal where selling is going to become, they're going to be doing it again. And I guess what I would want to hear from you is, do you have any thoughts, on how you throttle that, back up, in terms of still being sensitive that we have a big part of ourselves still in the crisis, but yet 25% of us is, moving into the new world order.
I don't think there's a new silver bullet. I mean, empathy is going to be a big part of learning how to sell again and how to engage in those conversations properly. And, I think with proper empathy, taking the time to understand from the people that you're selling to how they assess themselves through the crisis. And what are they now focused on doing that they weren't necessarily focused on doing prior to the crisis? And it's the things you and I have been talking about.
Yeah.
And your sales pitch starts from that base.
Right.
And I think if it starts from that base, you have credibility to actually pursue solutions that will help that company get better. You can take an example of an auto dealership. You know, people are not going in and out of auto dealerships frequently these days, other than for service, which has continued to do okay. But when you look at car sales, they're down tremendously.
Right.
And so if you're selling to a car dealer, how do you help them digitize their experience to their consumer?
Right.
What has to change? How do you customize the service in such a way that you can bring the car to them as opposed to them to the car?
Right.
And I don't have the answers to all of that, but those are solutions that auto dealers have to go working on.
Yeah, I've got a question that's come in that I want to just raise before we shift over. It's just from a small business owner, and he's asking, I think, a very practical question. He's essentially stating that he likes this notion of engaging customers and taking the pulse and sort of using it as a base. And so he's asking, what's the best method of doing that? And he's specifically saying, should we just do like a survey? And I think it's a great question. And one thing that I will say, in fact, I wrote a piece about this a while back, is that we are an over-surveyed nation. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that came from, companies that were using the Net Promoter Score as the basis for most of their, measurement of customer satisfaction. And so, it got to the point where you couldn't go to the bathroom without doing a survey about the experience. Yeah. And I'm coming back to something you said earlier, which is this notion of empathy. So, people could see right through a survey that's really trying to get their view. And again, whether it's a written survey or you're on the phone with them, but they can see right through a survey that's like trying to tick a box, so that the salesperson can get their incentives because they got a certain score. So to this person that's asked this question, I would say, not knowing your specific customer base, what I would say is be careful with the way in which you word the survey, whether it's obviously the best thing would be a one-on-one conversation or many conversations. But if you do decide that you, for efficiency, need to go the survey route, make sure that the survey is done in such a way that it really feels like you legitimately and genuinely want to hear their point of view. Yeah. And then make sure, by the way, that after you've heard their point of view, you have a way of going back to them to let them know what you heard and, more importantly, what you're doing as a result of the point of view. Otherwise, it's just another touch point, another survey. We get hit with them every day. And particularly right now, I find them very annoying, when we're being asked to survey, how did we do yesterday, in the takeout. I'm sorry, I just don't want to.
You're right in that every industry and every company is a little different. So there's no one way to do it perfectly. But, a lot of the things you just referenced are the best practices if you're going to survey. But I'm with you. Rather than how did we do, I would just like if there's one question you want me to answer, it's what could we have done better?
Exactly.
I don't care whether you got a 10 or an 8 on how we did, right? Yeah. What I care about is, do you really, really care about serving me even better going forward? And if you do, great. And if I have nothing to add to the great service you already provide, I'm just going to say nothing. Keep it up.
Yeah.
And that should be good enough. So I agree. To the question that came out, whatever the industry is, and whatever survey mechanism is best for that industry, make sure it includes one-on-one conversations, at least with a subset of the customer base you're trying to understand.
Here's another question that came in. It's labeled Dilemma in Des Moines. And I'll summarize the question, but essentially this is a small business owner that, actually has seen enormous efficiencies from working at home. And she is saying that if she had her preference, she'd never return to an office again.
Yeah.
But she's bringing up the exact point that we talked about earlier, that when she talks to her employees, young and old, by the way, she's really hearing that they want to return to an office. And so the dilemma that she has is that, part of her wants to sort of make this bold step into the future and ditch the office and go remote and save a lot of money. But yet culturally, would she create a problem that would make it harder to recruit the people that she needs and wants?
I think, I don't think you can take it in one giant leap.
Right.
I think you have to step your way through to the outcome. And if the outcome is, 80% of our time is going to be spent working remotely, then, that's an okay outcome. I think her opportunity in this is to not focus on the at work or not at work, or in an office or not in an office, but to focus on how do I make sure every single employee feels engaged with in the model that I want to go to.
Right.
And really understand what engaging them means. Not to just reference a former company that I worked at, but I saw Michael Dell recently read a storybook at, 10 in the morning, noon, whatever the time of the day it was. It was broadcast globally through a call with the homes of all of his employees where they had kids and were trying to learn how to balance caring for the kids at home while also doing their job. Yeah. And the message it sent was, hey, we are a place that cares. We understand that there's trade-offs that you're going to have to make in this new reality. We appreciate the trade-offs that you're making. And by the way, I want to make them too.
Yeah.
How can I help?
So, Christina,
I'm not saying that's what everybody has to do, but that's the kind of thought process I think will lead to people feeling more comfortable working in that environment than perhaps they do today.
So I can't, resist the opportunity to bring Christina into this part of the discussion, because Christina is a relatively new mom. And I know you enjoy the time with your precious baby, right? But I'm just guessing that, escaping to the office might not be something you wouldn't mind doing some more of in the future. Can you just kind of comment on your perspective on this whole working from home notion when you're a mom and you know?
For sure. It's been an interesting balance. I'm really fortunate that my husband also had already worked from home and had a fairly flexible job. So we do a lot of kind of tag teaming and trading off. And it's like handing the baby to someone as you kind of like trade in and out of a room with a closed door. But working at home is really nice because you can kind of pop out, say hi, kind of pop back in, kind of dive back into what you're doing. But on days when you're working on something you really need to focus on, or when you're on Zoom calls all day, when you're like, I would love to be in the office and like have this meeting face to face and not feel like I'm like trapped in a room in front of a screen for 6 hours. So it's nice. It does have its upsides because you feel like you get to kind of see them throughout the day, and you're not like, oh my gosh, I miss you. I haven't seen you all day. I've been away at the office, but it makes it a little bit trickier sometimes when you know they're right there and you kind of want to go hang out and you can hear them, and it's been interesting. So I don't know how everyone else's experience has been, but it changes every day.
One of the things that we really haven't spoken about that I think could be kind of interesting. So let's put our hats on that we represent a real estate company that has a lot of this office space that they need to fill. And so, it's not, to me, it's not just going to be either or, but it could be that these workplaces, I mean, if you look at the new Apple campus, it already suggests a reimagination of what you bring to a campus like that that makes going to work, easier.
Yeah.
Because, the cleaners is right there, childcare on site. So it could be that we see some pretty dramatic transformations of the workplace, quote unquote, that also could be,
Well,
innovative.
I think you're going to see a forcing of some of that, because just like our restaurant story about, the consumer is going to come back when they want to, the employees are the same way. I mean, I realize that you can say you must be at work by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and that's fine. And the employees can decide whether they feel comfortable doing that or not. And if the environment is not conducive to health, then they're not going to feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And so what immediately are they going to have to change? Cubicles can no longer be joined together with 4 people sitting in a small space.
Yeah.
It isn't going to work.
Right.
And so how do you address that? And so you're going to begin to see, I think, some changes to the way the work environment looks and feels almost immediately, in order to make employees or help employees feel comfortable coming back.
So let's just, in the few minutes that we have left, hit on that last topic of how do we sustain some of these changes that maybe we've been forced to bring into practice, but now that they're there, we see value. So how do we sustain them? What are some of your thoughts on sustaining the new model?
We touched a couple of them. I'll touch a couple more. I mean, working from home is here to stay in some form or fashion. It doesn't have to be 100%, but it's going to be bigger than it's been. Excessive cleaning is here to stay. It's never going to change. I know we're all tired of washing our hands and wearing our masks, but the reality is that's going to be here for a long time.
Right.
Zero touch. This notion of digitization is not only a great idea for making sure you can serve your customers in a pandemic, but it's also a great idea for making you a much more efficient business, so that you can really streamline and therefore focus on the things that really do matter to customers and to employees. I think the whole notion of, online is another form of that. And so continuing to see, this total transparency, to be able to give data, give information, enable your customers to make decisions with resources that you didn't previously provide to them. Right. I think all that's going to happen. And so those are the things that I would put into the sustain column.
Yeah.
The curbside pickup at a grocery store. That's, I know they were experimenting with that big time prior to COVID.
Right.
It's going to get bigger now, without a doubt. And so those things are here to stay. And reorienting your entire thought process as a small business or as a business owner or whatever business to support those things is going to require the trade-offs and stuff that we talked about before. And I think if you think this too shall pass, then you won't make the change.
Yeah.
If you actually believe it's there forever, then you're going to make the change.
One of the things that I think we're going to have to be sensitive to is how people experience some of these things in their own way. I'm going to give a personal example. One of my dearest friends and colleagues, and in fact mentor, was a guy named Terry Young. He passed away a couple years ago, but great man. And when I first moved back to Texas, I bought into this little firm called Reed Poland, and it was celebrating its 50th anniversary, right? And great firm. And Julian Reed did the to-do list for everybody. Okay, when you came into the office, he got there at 6:30. When you got there at 7:30 or 8. There was a to-do list sitting on your desk, the master to-do list for that day for the whole office, right? So at any rate, needless to say that I was coming in to kind of modernize it a little bit, right? And so one of the first things we did, we had a parent company that had kind of acquired us called GCI. And they were cutting checks, physical checks, every week. And, every Friday morning, they'd come in and there'd be an envelope and there's your check for that week. And so I come in and say, hey, we're going to automate this. We're basically going to move to direct deposit. And of course, I'm thinking everybody's going to love this. I mean, this is going to be great. You don't have to mess with a check and you got to go to the bank. And there was all this dissatisfaction, and I couldn't figure it out. I mean, what could be more, liberating? And Terry pulled me aside one day and he said, Jeff, do you realize that when I walk to the bank, which is about 4 blocks away, first off, I'm seeing people that I know, in town and stopping and talking to them. When I get to the bank, I know the teller. And in fact, I love the teller and she loves me. And we like seeing each other once a week and we share stories and I ask about her family. So what you did when you went to direct deposit is you cut out a big social experience for me. And I'm pissed. I don't like it. And it really hit me, that you've got to be careful when you're thinking about these things, whether it's some people actually enjoy going to the grocery store. I'm one of them, by the way. I enjoy walking the grocery store to prepare for that evening's meal. My daughter hates it. She'd rather just get, the groceries delivered, right? So I guess I'm kind of, rambling here, but I think the notion that there's not going to be a one size fits all, approach.
Yeah.
But what you were saying earlier, the ability to be kind of adaptable and serve many needs, curbside, in restaurant dining, that's probably the reality.
Yeah. I know we're running short on time. I would just tell you the one point that we touched earlier that I want to reemphasize is this is a chance to play offense. The vast majority of your competitors are going to be playing defense.
Right.
And if you've established a reasonably good basis around those, digitization, employee, customer purpose, and you from that foundation can step on the gas, there's share to be gained. And there's the equation of your little industry, whatever that industry is, can change, can move. And I just see this as an opportunity for people to be able to do that. And so look for those, because that's what your employees are going to hold on to as well.
Yeah.
Are we going someplace, or are we just, is survival all I can expect?
Right.
And if it's survival, they're going to start looking for some place that's got a little more certainty than that.
Yeah. Well, Steve, this has been really great. I really appreciate your time. And by the way, we have an old friend of ours on the line with us, Bruce Anderson, coming to us from Minneapolis. Bruce, great to have you ask the question. So Bruce's question, and I'm assuming the answer is yes, but will this be available so that if he wants to share it with colleagues down the road, will it be archived and available? I'm pretty sure the answer to that is yes, Bruce. But anyway, Bruce, thanks for being here with us, and some of the other friends and colleagues that have joined. And thanks to everyone, frankly. We really appreciate your time. Hopefully this conversation has illuminated some ideas that maybe you can act upon. Feel free to shoot us feedback. Thoughts that you have are always welcomed. And wish you all a great rest of your week. And stay tuned. We'll let you know when we're going to do the next Conversation in Crisis. Have a great day.